Infamous throughout the early 20th century, one house in England would become the scene of terrifying paranormal activity. Witnessed by hundreds of people over many years, we ask whether there was any truth to the alleged ghosts of Borley Rectory. Towards the east coast of England, right on the border between Essex and Suffolk, there is an inconspicuous, sparsely populated village known as Borley. To an outsider looking in, it is unremarkable. Idyllic for those in love with the quaintness of the English countryside, but for more adventurous folk, it seems very much a place where nothing ever happens. And of course that would be true, if not for one small detail: this little village, situated in the middle of nowhere, once played host to the most haunted house in England. Borley Rectory was a relative flash in the pan. A house built to last for hundreds of years, but which stood for less than 80. Despite this, it managed to cement its place in history. Its name became synonymous with ghostly apparitions, violent poltergeist activity, and other terrifying phenomena that defied rational explanation. There is an extensive anthology of reports from hundreds of residents, tourists, and newspaper reporters, who had experiences within not just the house, but the grounds as well, each of whom had their own stories to tell. However, as we shall see, this history does not exist without doubt. Or for that matter, controversy. Borley Rectory was constructed in 1862, on Hull Road, opposite Borley Church. Built as a replacement for a previous rectory, which had burnt down in 1841, the property boasted 23 rooms, and was surrounded by 4 acres of land. Constructed using red brick, its neo-Gothic architecture sat in stark contrast to the lush green trees and hedgerows that complemented the grounds. Somewhat mysteriously, a network of tunnels and vaults existed beneath these grounds, but even to this day, no one has ever understood their true purpose. It was said that Borley Rectory was built on the same plot of land as a Cistercian monastery, which existed more than 500 years prior to its construction. And it is perhaps for this reason that many of the villagers viewed this new building with a degree of superstition. Long before it was even completed, strange activity such as phantom footsteps and the disembodied cries of a young lady had been heard in the area. The ghostly apparition of a nun had also been witnessed many times over the centuries, walking across the grounds before fading out of view. Whilst this may seem strange, as one would expect to see a monk rather than a nun if a story of forbidden love would serve as the backdrop for this apparent anomaly, legend has it that an illicit affair dating back to the 14th century occurred between a monk from the monastery and a nun from a local Benedictine convent. The two of them planned to elope and settle down elsewhere in the country, at which point they would wed. Shortly after they had run away, however, they were hunted down and captured, and the local community spared little in the way of retribution. The monk was hanged, whilst the nun was apparently bricked up inside the monastery walls whilst still alive, and left to rot. There was also a second tale involving another nun, which took place 300 years later. Henry Waldegrave, owner of a manor which stood on the same land, apparently married a French nun who had moved to the area, known as Marie Lear. The story goes that one evening, in a fit of rage, Henry strangled her to death and covered up the murder by burying her in the cellar. The same cellar that would later be used in the construction of Borley Rectory. It is no surprise, then, that tales of paranormal activity occurring on the property were commonplace before the first occupants even moved in. Records show that the first resident was Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull. Bull moved into the rectory with his wife, and would go on to raise 14 children there. Such a large family required bigger and more suitable living quarters, and this led to the addition of a new wing in 1871. Many sources state that Bull and his family experienced strange occurrences from the outset. The Reverend became fascinated with the bizarre phenomena, and requested that a summer house be built overlooking a small stretch of the grounds, where the nun was seen most often. The family dubbed this area Nun's Walk, and Bull would spend many evenings after dinner sitting outside the summer house, cigar in hand, trying to catch a staff, and even guests at the rectory would often be found in shock and fearing for their lives after seeing faceless figures peering at them through the windows of the main house. Suffice it to say that servants rarely stayed there for long. Henry Bull passed away in 1892, leaving the property to his son, Harry. On the 28th of July, 1900, 4 of Harry's daughters were exploring the grounds when they caught sight of the nun, about 40 yards from the main house. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to try and talk to her. But to their complete shock, the figure simply vanished into thin air as they approached it. The parish organist, Ernest Ambrose, was on record as saying that the Bulls were very convinced that they had seen an apparition on several occasions. This was further supported by various people living within the vicinity of the rectory, who also claimed to have witnessed ghostly figures walking across the grounds. Henry's daughters would go on to witness more appearances of the fabled nun, and would often see her wandering the premises during the daytime and throughout the evenings. Further apparitions occurred, and the daughters would soon learn of other spirits which haunted the rectory. Often, a phantom coach would be seen racing up the track towards the main house, vanishing only moments before it would have crashed into the front windows. Harry Bull would remain at Borley Rectory until his death in 1929. The lease would then pass to Reverend Eric Smith and his wife, who moved in shortly afterwards. Already well aware of the rectory's eerie past, the new residents were understandably apprehensive, and it wasn't long before this feeling was fully justified. One morning whilst cleaning out a cupboard, Smith's wife discovered the skull of a young woman inside a brown paper bag. She would go on to claim that she began hearing the inexplicable ringing of servant bells, which had in fact been disconnected. She also stated that on several occasions, the sound of footsteps could be heard throughout the building, in areas of the house that were supposedly empty. Whilst these claims were somewhat different to past occurrences, Mrs. Smith reported that on one occasion, she too witnessed the apparition of a horse-drawn carriage racing up the track towards the house. These events would eventually escalate to a point where the couple involved the media, a decision which would heighten the rectory's infamy throughout the UK, and in time, the world. Understandably, the Smiths felt uncomfortable and in some cases terrified in their own home. They took it upon themselves to report their experiences to the Daily Mirror, where they asked to be put in touch with the Society for Psychical Research. On the 10th of June, 1929, the newspaper sent a reporter who promptly explored the rectory and detailed its history within a series of articles. The paper also arranged for Harry Price, an acclaimed and well-known paranormal researcher, to make his first visit to the home. He would investigate the property in the hopes of either proving or disproving the paranormal activity. However, Price's presence sparked an intense and aggressive pattern of blatant and increasingly chilling poltergeist activity. He later recalled stories of stones, vases, and other household objects being thrown at him during his investigations. In addition to this, what he termed spirit messages were tapped out from the frame of a mirror. Curiously, these specific activities ceased suddenly and somewhat conveniently following Price's exit. Smith's wife would later claim that she already suspected Price, an expert conjurer, of falsifying the phenomena to benefit his career. Despite this, the ghostly occurrences did not end completely after his departure. The Smiths left Borley Rectory within 2 years, turning away from the remote and creepy household once and for all. What had begun as unsettling, though harmless phenomena seemed to have taken a turn for the worse. Unfortunately, the hauntings and poltergeist activity did not relent for the succeeding residents of the rectory. Reverend Lionel Foyster, his wife Mary Ann, and their adopted daughter, Adelaide. On the contrary, Foyster wrote accounts of various inexplicable incidents that occurred. Harry Price once again found himself at the property to determine the validity of the claims. The Foysters experienced hearing inexplicable bell ringing, windows shattering of their own accord, and the throwing of stones and bottles. More chillingly, they described wall writing, and the locking of their daughter in a room with no key. The poltergeist also became increasingly drawn to the Reverend's young wife. On several occasions, Marianne fell victim to physical attacks, where household objects were thrown at her. In one instance, she claimed to have been physically thrown from her bed by an unseen force. However, what truly terrified the young family were the messages scrawled out of thin air on the walls of the house. Unfortunately, most of these writings could not be interpreted by either Price or the family. Only 2 could be clearly understood. They read, "Please for help and prayers," and "Marianne, please get help." In his desperation, Foister chose to have Borley Rectory exorcised, twice attempting to conduct the exorcism himself. To the family's surprise, these rituals seemed to have been a success, and the activities ceased. This reprieve would be short-lived, however. The phenomena resurfaced, but this time it came in different and mysterious forms. Marianne told of how their daughter was attacked by something horrible, whilst at night, outlandish music would be heard emanating from the nearby church, despite it being empty. Bizarrely, at the end of a service in the same church, the communion wine seemingly turned into ink without any apparent explanation. This accumulation of events reached a tipping point for the family, who eventually moved out. The Foisters left, and all following officials of the church refused to take up residence at Borley Rectory. It would stand empty for almost 2 years. Nonetheless, in 1937, Harry Price, the intrepid paranormal researcher, returned and leased the property for 12 months. His objective was clear: to investigate the phenomena at length and uninterrupted by any resident families. He assembled a team of 48 other researchers and observers, and over the next year, compiled an extensive and extraordinary number of eyewitness accounts of paranormal instances. Some of the findings included areas of the building being significantly and inexplicably hotter or colder than others. Coats without a body in them were seen gliding through the house, as well as the standard noises being heard and objects being thrown, which had been witnessed historically. The most notable of these activities occurred outside the confines of Borley Rectory. Helen Glanville, daughter of one of Price's staff, conducted a séance in the summer house. Glanville claimed to have made contact with 2 spirits from the rectory. The first identified itself as Marie Lear, the young French nun who married Henry Waldegrave. Marie Lear claimed to have been murdered in an old building on the premises and buried in the cellar, whilst also claiming responsibility for the writings on the wall aimed at Marianne. The second spirit Glanville contacted identified themselves as Sunnex Amures. Amures threatened to set fire to the rectory and said that the bones of a murdered person would be found within the ruins. By 1938, Price's tenancy had ended, and the rectory was taken over by a man named Captain Gregson, who aimed to capitalize on its infamous reputation by giving guided tours. He too became plagued by paranormal happenings, not least the unusual disappearance of his 2 dogs. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on how one looks at it, his tenancy would be brief. Exactly 11 months to the day after the sinister warning from the séance, an oil lamp in the hall was said to have fallen over of its own accord. The fire quickly spread, and the house was irreparably damaged. The insurance company investigating the cause of the blaze concluded that the fire was caused deliberately, though Gregson attested that he was not responsible. When interviews were conducted following the fire, witnesses claimed to have seen ghostly figures roaming around and through the flames, and some even described sightings of a nun's face peering down from an upper window at the rapidly spreading fire below. Despite the abundance of eyewitness accounts from the many residents, locals, and tourists, there are also those who doubt the validity of the hauntings. Following Price's death in 1948, Charles Sutton, a reporter from the Daily Mail, was quick to raise allegations that much of Price's recorded activity was faked, all designed to further his career and raise his profile. Sutton claimed that whilst visiting Borley Rectory with Price in 1929, he was hit on the head with a large stone. Sensing the ploy, he grabbed Price and found that he had a stash of similar stones hidden in his coat pockets. These accusations of fraud were supported by 3 members of the Society for Psychical Research in their book, The Haunting of Borley Rectory. 2 of the authors were present during Price's tenancy, and also heavily questioned the legitimacy of his findings, concluding that the majority of the phenomena was fraudulent. The report, which would come to be known simply as the Borley Report, attributed many of the happenings to natural causes, including rats and the natural acoustics of the house. They also noted how the activity would increase and decrease accordingly whenever Price and Marianne Foister were present or had left the building. Terence Hines, an investigator of paranormal, wrote, Mrs. Marianne Foister, wife of the Reverend Lionel Foister, who lived at the rectory from 1930 to 1935, was actively engaged in fraudulently creating the phenomena. Price himself salted the mine and faked several phenomena while he was at the rectory. This seemed to be confirmed when later in her life, Mary Ann Foister would admit that she had seen no apparitions, and that the alleged ghostly noises were simply caused by the wind, and in other cases by herself, when she played practical jokes on her husband. She also later confessed that she was having an affair with a lodger, Frank Peerless, and that she had used the excuse of helping investigate the haunting to slip away from her husband. The children of the Reverend Harry Bull, who lived in the house before Lionel Foister, also claimed to have seen nothing, and were surprised to find out that they had been living in what was described as England's most haunted house. If these admissions weren't enough to cast doubt, it was confirmed in 1938 that the folktales regarding the two nuns buried inside the walls of the rectory had no historical basis, and seemed to have been fabricated by the rector's children, perhaps to romanticize the Gothic-style rectory. The story of the walling up of the nun may in fact have come from Rider Haggard's 1893 novel Montezuma's Daughter, or Walter Scott's epic 1808 poem Marmion. Harry Price returned to the site of Borley Rectory for the final time in August 1943. Supposedly to try and satisfy his intrigue once and for all. Whilst digging in the ruins of the cellars, he discovered what appeared to be the jawbone of a young woman. Convinced that it was part of the body of the infamous ghostly nun, he attempted to end the hauntings by giving the Christian burial. However, the bones were later alleged to be those of a pig, and were instead buried nearby in Liston churchyard, after the parish of Borley refused to allow the ceremony. Regardless, the burial does not seem to have brought peace to the area. Paranormal events are still reported at the site of the rectory and the nearby churchyard to this day, despite the clear embellishments and fraudulent claims that have been made over the years. The ground upon which Borley Rectory once stood certainly has an eerie vibe to it that visitors cannot seem to explain. It is difficult to dismiss the huge plethora of reports and witness testimonies, and many of those who reside in or near the parish certainly believe there is a paranormal energy that lurks at the site. Perhaps many of the false claims were simply a case of people trying to capitalize on legitimate activity, which the rectory was host to. These individuals, such as Harry Price and Mary Ann Foister, should by no means discredit the many other claims made by people with no apparent motive. Towards the east coast of England, right on the border between Essex and Suffolk, there is an inconspicuous, sparsely populated village known as Borley, which once basked in the infamy of hosting England's most haunted house. Looking across the road from the churchyard, you will see only the empty ground upon which this house once stood, and maybe, just maybe, you may catch a glimpse of a ghost or two.